The Arizona Territory burned under a noon sun that felt close enough to touch. Heat shimmered across the sand like waves on a boiling sea, and every breath drew dust instead of air. A rickety wagon sat tilted on one broken wheel, half buried in the sand. Under its shadow, a boy and an old woman waited. For what? Neither of them could say anymore. Tommy Breslin was 8 years old, thin as a reed and brown from sun and dirt. His grandmother Ruth lay beside him, her skin gray and cracked, lips too dry to speak. For days earlier, they had started toward Prescott, chasing a promise of safety that was already fading into mirage. A hired driver had agreed to take them the whole way for $10. Halfway through the journey, he'd pulled the reins, spat in the dust, and said he wanted 5 more. Ruth had looked at him, weary but proud. "We don't have another dime," she said. The man's eyes had gone cold. "Then you can walk." He unhitched the horse, climbed up, and left them standing in the desert. 2 lost souls beside a busted wagon, 40 miles from the nearest town. The trail dust rose behind him until he disappeared into the heat. They'd had half a canteen of water then. Ruth had pressed it into Tommy's hands. "Sip, not swallow," she told him. "We'll find help soon." But even as she said it, she knew the truth. There was no help coming across that horizon. The first 2 days were a blur of heat and waiting. Tommy tried to be brave, but the desert was a cruel teacher. The sun beat down until the wagon's iron bolts burned to the touch. They took shelter beneath it, the air still thick and stifling. Ruth gave most of the water to Tommy, pretending she wasn't thirsty. "I've had plenty in my time," she'd whisper, forcing a smile. He didn't understand why she refused the canteen, but he obeyed. She'd break off bits of a dried apple, hand them to him one by one, and tell stories about his father, Daniel Breslin, the miner who'd once carried Tommy on his shoulders through the streets of Jerome. Daniel had died when a mine collapsed, leaving nothing but a claim nobody cared to touch. Tommy's mother, Violet, had remarried within a year, a gambler named Frank Carver who talked smooth and hit hard. When the boy had become an inconvenience, Violet had sent him to Ruth, saying, "He'll be better off with you." That had been the last they'd heard from her. By the end of the second day, their water was gone. The desert turned quiet except for the rasp of their breathing. Ruth's sugar sickness was getting worse. Her hands trembled, and she slipped in and out of sense. When night fell, the air grew cold enough to make Tommy shiver. Coyotes howled somewhere out in the dark. Ruth gathered him close and told another story, her voice a thread. "When your pa was your age, he got lost in a storm," she said. "Found his way home by following the stars. You remember that, Tommy. The stars always point home." He looked up through the wagon spokes and tried to believe her. On the third morning, Ruth couldn't stand. She tried to crawl toward the trail, thinking if she could just reach the ruts left by passing wagons, someone might see them. But the heat hit like a hammer, and she collapsed halfway there. Tommy knelt beside her, fanning her face with his small hands. "Don't leave me, Grandma," he whispered. She smiled faintly, her eyes half open. "I'm not leaving, sweetheart. Just resting." The sky was a blinding white. Vultures circled above, patient and silent. Tommy's lips were cracked and bleeding. He no longer cried. He didn't have the strength. "I'm not scared, Grandma," he murmured. "We'll see Papa soon." Ruth stirred, tried to speak, but only managed a whisper that vanished in the wind. Then, somewhere beyond the still air, came a sound she thought she imagined at first. Hoofbeats, steady and slow. She forced her head up. A dark figure approached through the shimmer. A horse, tall and chestnut-colored, carrying a man with the look of the frontier carved into his face. He was broad-shouldered, sun-scarred, and moved with the tired certainty of someone who'd seen too many lonely miles. Jacob Stone reined in his horse beside the broken wagon. For a heartbeat, he thought they were already gone. The woman sprawled in the dust. The boy slumped beside her. Then the boy's hand twitched. "Hold on," Jacob muttered, swinging down. He knelt, felt for breath at the woman's lips, faint but there. The boy's pulse was stronger, though his skin was hot as fire. Jacob pulled his canteen, lifted Tommy's head, and poured a trickle of water into his mouth. The child swallowed weakly. "Easy, son. Not too much." Ruth's eyes fluttered open. She saw the outline of the cowboy and thought maybe she was dreaming. Who are you?" she rasped. "Name's Jacob Stone," he said. "You're safe now." He soaked a cloth and pressed it to her forehead. She winced but didn't pull away. "How long you been out here?" "For days," she managed. "Driver left us. Thought we'd die quicker." Jacob's jaw clenched. He'd seen cruelty before, but leaving an old woman and a boy in this heat, that was devil's work. "You're lucky I took the South Trail," he said quietly. "Most folks ride north this time of year." He lifted Ruth first, light as kindling in his arms, and laid her across the horse's flank. Then he turned to Tommy. The boy's eyes opened just enough to meet his. Jacob smiled, rough and gentle at once. "Come home, son," he said. "I've got you now." Tommy tried to answer, but only a small sound came out. Jacob mounted with the child in front of him, one arm steady around the boy, the other holding the reins. He glanced once at the wagon, abandoned and half-buried. A gust of wind blew sand over the wheel, as if the desert itself were already claiming it. As he started the long ride back toward Stone's Run Ranch, Jacob felt the weight of the boy against his chest, fragile, feverish, alive. Behind them, the horizon shimmered empty. Ahead lay 40 miles of hard country and one chance at saving 2 lives. The sun began to sink, staining the sky the color of blood and rust. He rode faster. What Jacob Stone didn't know was that the woman waiting at his ranch, Shella Martinez, who had loved him in silence for 10 long years, was about to have her quiet world turned upside down. And 5 miles away, in a dusty saloon in Dust Hollow, Frank Carver was already asking questions. Because that boy Jacob carried in his arms wasn't just a lost child in the desert. He was the key to a fortune, and Frank Carver didn't believe in mercy. The sun had already slid behind the jagged hills by the time Jacob Stone reached his ranch. The air cooled just enough to breathe again, and the scent of dust and sagebrush followed him through the gate marked Stone's Run. The ranch stretched wide and lonely, weathered fences, a corral, and the main house built of rough pine and sweat. 2 ranch hands looked up from a barn when they heard the hoofbeats. Hector, gray-bearded and loyal as any man Jacob had ever known, shouted, "Boss, that you?" Behind him, Dale, young and strong but still learning, squinted at the sight of 2 limp bodies on the horse. "Found trouble, did ya?" Hector asked as Jacob swung down. "Found a dying boy and his grandmother in the desert." Jacob said simply, "Get water. Blankets. Now." From a porch, a woman stepped into the fading light. Shella Martinez had lived on that ranch for 10 years, and in all that time, she'd never once looked less than steady. Her dark hair was braided, her sleeves rolled up, and her eyes, soft but sharp, searched Jacob's face before falling on the strangers in his arms. "Dear Lord," she whispered, "bring them inside." Shella's hands moved fast, guiding them to the spare room, barking orders like a nurse in a war camp. "Hector, more water." "Dale, light the stove." "Jacob, help me lift her." Jacob obeyed without a word. He hadn't seen Shella this alive in years. When the woman was settled, Shella pressed her ear to Ruth's chest. "Her pulse is weak. Heat stroke and infection. She's burning up." She turned to the boy. "He'll live if we cool him down quick." She soaked cloths, wrapped them around Tommy's wrists and neck, and spooned tiny drops of water between his lips. Jacob stood watching, guilt creeping in for how long he'd been blind to the quiet strength of the woman before him. Shella had been Maria's best friend, his late wife's shadow, and when Maria died of cholera along with their little girl, Sarah, Shella had stayed. Most would have left. She didn't. She cooked, kept the ranch running, and filled the silence of a house that had forgotten laughter. For 10 years, she'd watched Jacob drift through life like a ghost, never asking for anything, never leaving. Folks in town thought she was the housekeeper. In truth, she was the one thing holding that house together. But in that moment, as she worked to save Ruth and Tommy, she wasn't a housekeeper. She was a storm of mercy and willpower. Over the next few hours, Shella boiled herbs, cooled fevers, and whispered prayers. When Ruth started to stir, Jacob let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "She's strong," Shella said softly, "but she'll need days, maybe weeks." Jacob nodded, his gaze drifting to Tommy curled up on the cot beside his grandmother. "He reminded me of Sarah," he murmured. Shella's eyes flickered. She knew the weight of that name. "Then you'll take care of him like you did her." For the first time in years, Jacob didn't have an answer. That night, as the crickets started their song, Shella sat by Ruth's bedside, wiping sweat from her brow while Jacob brought in another basin of water. Hector leaned against the doorframe, muttering, "Miss Shella's wearing herself thin." Jacob poured fresh water into the bowl. "She won't stop until that woman lives," he said. "That's the kind of heart she's got." 3 days passed before Ruth's fever broke. She drifted in and out of dreams, whispering names that made no sense. Shella never left her side, sleeping in a chair and waking every hour to check her pulse. Jacob tried to make her rest. Once, he came into the kitchen late at night and found Shella half asleep over a pot of broth. "You can't keep this up," he said. She looked up, weary but smiling. "Someone has to." He set a plate in front of her. "Eat, Shella. You're no good to her if you drop." She hesitated, then obeyed, quietly touched by the rare softness in his tone. In those long nights, something shifted. Jacob started bringing her coffee the way she liked it, and when their hands brushed, neither pulled away too quickly. Tommy grew stronger with each sunrise. He followed Jacob around the ranch, small boots kicking up dust. At first, Jacob didn't know what to do with him, but Tommy's curiosity was relentless. "What's that horse's name?" he asked. "Copper," Jacob said. "She fast. Fast enough. Can I ride her someday?" Jacob chuckled, a sound that felt strange coming out of him. "Maybe when your legs catch up to your mouth." Soon Tommy was helping feed the chickens, carry buckets, and brush down horses. He'd run to show Shella every discovery, an oddly shaped rock, a feather, a lizard that slipped through his fingers. "Miss Shella, look. Mr. Jacob says this is quartz." "He's right," she'd say, smiling. "You're learning quick." Evenings were the quietest. Jacob would read by lamplight, old books Maria had once read to Sarah. One night, Tommy climbed onto his lap and listened wide-eyed. When Jacob closed the book, the boy asked, "Can I call you Pa?" The words hit Jacob like a bullet and a blessing at once. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice rough with something he hadn't felt in years, he answered, "If you want to, son." Tommy's face lit up like dawn, and Jacob had to turn away so the boy wouldn't see the tears gathering in his eyes. By the third week, Ruth opened her eyes fully. Her first word was Tommy's name. The boy flew into her arms. "I told you we'd make it," he said. Ruth's lips trembled as she looked around. "Where are we?" "Safe," Shella said gently. "You're on Stone's Run Ranch. Jacob found you." Ruth reached for Shella's hand. "You saved me." "We all did," Shella replied. But Ruth held her gaze a little longer, as if seeing something deeper. The old woman's eyes, though clouded with weakness, carried the kind of wisdom only hardship gives. She saw how Jacob looked at Shella when he thought no one noticed. She saw the fear in Shella's kindness, the kind of fear that comes from loving someone who may never love you back. That evening, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. Dale rode hard into the yard, his face pale. "Rider from town, boss," he shouted. Jacob stepped outside, hand on his holster. The messenger reined in and handed him a note. From Dust Hollow. "Thought you'd want to know. Frank Carver's been in town to scan about a boy named Tommy Breslin." The words hit like a storm. Ruth's face drained of color. "He found us." Tommy, who'd been standing near the porch, froze. "Grandma, what's wrong?" She pulled him close. Nothing, baby. It's all right. But her voice shook. Tommy tore away and ran to Jacob. He's coming. Frank's coming to take me. Jacob knelt, resting his big hands on the boy's shoulders. Who's Frank Carver? Tommy's answer came in a whisper. My mama's husband. He said I'm worth money. He said Grandma stole me. Jacob's jaw tightened, and the muscles in his neck went hard as stone. He'll have to go through me first, he said quietly. Ruth put a trembling hand on Jacob's arm. You don't understand, Mr. Stone. That man doesn't give up. He'll use the law, or guns, or both. Jacob rose to his full height. Then he'll find both waiting. He turned toward the fading light where the dust still hung in the air, and in that moment, the quiet ranch seemed smaller, fragile against whatever storm was coming. Inside, Shella watched from the doorway, fear shadowing her face. She knew this peace they'd built was about to be tested. But she also knew one thing with certainty. Jacob Stone would fight like a man who finally had something, and someone to fight for. And as the last of the daylight slipped behind the hills, the wind carried a promise through the valley. Trouble was coming to Stone's Run Ranch, and none of their lives would ever be the same again. Morning light washed the valley in gold, soft and forgiving after the hard days that had come before. Stone's Run Ranch felt alive again, smoke rising from the chimney, horses stirring in the corral, and the sound of Tommy's laughter echoing across the yard as he chased a hen that refused to be caught. Ruth Breslin sat on the porch wrapped in a shawl, pale but stronger than she'd been since Jacob found her. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were clear, full of quiet purpose. When Jacob and Shella came out with breakfast, she smiled faintly. You both fuss like I'm a dying woman, she teased, her voice rasped but stubborn. You nearly were, Shella said, setting the tray beside her. Don't start another argument, so soon after waking from the grave. Ruth chuckled, then grew serious. It's time I told you both why we ended up out there. Jacob and Shella exchanged a look, but said nothing. Ruth took a slow breath and began. She told them about her son, Daniel Breslin, how he died in a mine collapse and left behind not just a widow and child, but a valuable mining claim near Jerome, worth more than any of them had imagined. She told them about Violet, her daughter-in-law, and the man she married after Daniel's death, Frank Carver, a gambler who saw Tommy's inheritance as his ticket to fortune. He wanted the claim, Ruth said, but the law gave me custody. He swore he'd take the boy back one way or another. Her voice cracked. We were on our way to Prescott to find my sister when that driver left us to die. Jacob's jaw tightened, his knuckles white around his coffee cup. You won't touch that boy again, he said flatly. Not while he's on my land. Shella frowned. Frank sounds dangerous, Jacob. If he's got money or men, Ruth raised a thin hand. He's got both, and no conscience to speak of. Silence settled over them until Tommy's laughter broke it again. He was chasing a puppy now, all sunshine and innocence. Ruth watched him and whispered, that boy's worth more than gold. And that's what makes men like Frank come running. Over the next few days, Ruth grew stronger, but her body wasn't the only thing healing. Her mind was sharp, and her eyes noticed everything. She saw the way Jacob glanced at Shella when he thought no one saw him. She saw how Shella's hands trembled just slightly whenever she brought Jacob his coffee. She watched them talk on the porch, quiet and comfortable like two people who belonged together but hadn't realized it yet. One afternoon, when Shella came in from hanging laundry, Ruth called her to the kitchen. Sit down, child, she said kindly. I need to ask you something. Shella hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron. Of course, Mrs. Breslin. How long have you loved him? The question hit like a slap. Shella froze. I don't know what you mean. Ruth's lips curved into a knowing smile. I may be old, but I ain't blind. The way you look at him, the way your voice softens when you say his name. It's been years, hasn't it? Shella's eyes filled with tears. Since before Maria died, she admitted in a whisper. But she was my best friend. I'd never dishonor her like that. Ruth reached out, patting her hand. Love don't ask permission, dear. It just happens. Shella looked down, her voice shaking. After Maria passed, I thought maybe one day he'd see me. But he's still in love with her memory. 10 years, Mrs. Breslin. 10 years I've waited, running this house, keeping him fed, fixing things he doesn't even notice. But he doesn't see me. Not really. Ruth studied her face. He will when he's ready. Men like Jacob, grief carves them hollow. Takes time to fill the empty places again. What if he never does? Shella asked, voice trembling. Then you keep living anyway, Ruth said softly. But don't hide what's in your heart. Life's too short to love in silence. Shella wiped her eyes and nodded, though her fear stayed. Later that evening, Jacob returned from town with supplies, dust in his hair and weariness in his eyes. Tommy ran to him, proud to show the small wooden horse Dale had carved for him. Look, Pa, it's just like copper. Jacob ruffled his hair and smiled. That's fine work, son. The word Pa still made his heart twist each time he heard it. He looked at Ruth sitting on the porch and Shella standing in the doorway, and for the first time in a long while, the place felt like home. He spent the next week teaching Tommy to ride, his big hands guiding the reins while the boys' laughter filled the yard. Shella watched from the porch, her chest tight with something she couldn't name. Pride, sorrow, love, all tangled together. Ruth noticed it too, smiling quietly to herself. That night, Shella stood by the window, watching Jacob lift Tommy off the horse and carry him to bed, the boy already half asleep. When Jacob lingered by the child's side, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, Shella's heart ached. He was learning to be a father again, and somehow that made her love him more. But it also terrified her, because Ruth and Tommy would leave one day, and she feared Jacob's heart would close again, taking all her unspoken love with it. A few nights later, Dale came storming into the house, his face grim. "Riders on the ridge," he said. 3 of them. Been watching the ranch for near an hour. Jacob followed him outside, squinting toward the hills. Sure enough, 3 silhouettes sat against the dying light, motionless. "They're watching us," Hector said from the porch. "Could be Frank's men." Jacob nodded slowly. "Could be. Let him watch for now. I want to see what they're after." For the next 2 days, the riders didn't approach, just lingered like shadows. Tommy grew nervous again, clinging to Shella. "They're coming for me, ain't they?" "No, sweetheart," she whispered, pulling him close. "You're safe here." Jacob tightened security, rifles loaded, men keeping watch through the night. He told Tommy, "You got my word, son. No one's taking you. You hear me?" Tommy nodded, trusting him completely. That night, when the house had gone quiet, Ruth called Jacob and Shella into her room. The lantern light flickered over her lined face. "I need to tell you both something," she said softly. "I'm grateful for everything you've done, but I won't be the reason this family stays broken." Jacob frowned. "What do you mean?" Ruth looked from him to Shella, her gaze warm but sharp. "Some people spend their whole lives looking for love. Others have it right in front of them and are too blind to see it." Shella froze, her cheeks flushing red. Jacob opened his mouth, but Ruth raised her hand. "Don't speak. Just think on it. The world don't hand out second chances often. Don't waste yours." And she leaned back against her pillow, closing her eyes. The room went still, and for a long while, neither Jacob nor Shella said a word. Outside, the wind whispered through the mesquite trees, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of change. And though no one spoke it aloud, they all knew. The peace on Stone's Run Ranch was about to break, and hearts that had hidden too long would soon have to choose between fear and love. The dawn broke hard and red over Stone's Run Ranch, painting the sky like a warning. Hector was the first to spot them, 6 riders cresting the ridge with a swagger that meant trouble. "Boss!" he shouted, running toward the corral. Jacob stepped out of the barn, already reaching for his rifle. The lead rider was easy to recognize even from a distance. Frank Carver, slick, sharp-dressed, the kind of man whose smile could chill a room. He wore a black hat, a dust-stained suit, and arrogance like perfume. His men followed, armed and grinning. "Stay inside," Jacob told Shella, his voice like iron. "Keep the boy with you." She tried to argue, but one look at his eyes, steady, cold, ready, told her not to. She grabbed Tommy by the shoulders. "You stay near me, understand?" The boy nodded, trembling. When Frank reached the yard, he dismounted slow, enjoying the show. "Mighty fine place you got here, Stone," he said, brushing off his jacket. "Heard you found something of mine out there in the desert." Jacob's hand rested on the rifle, but didn't lift it. "If you're talking about the boy, he's not yours." Frank smirked. "Got papers say otherwise." He pulled out a folded document, shaking it like a winning hand of cards. "Custody transfer, signed by his mama, Violet Carver." Jacob's jaw twitched. "You forged it." Frank's eyes gleamed. "Prove it." Behind him, his men spread out casually, but their hands hovered near their holsters. Hector and Dale appeared on the porch with rifles leveled. The air turned razor sharp. "You're trespassing," Jacob said quietly. "You best ride out before somebody gets hurt." Frank tilted his head. "Now, that sounds like a threat. Call it what you want." For a moment, no one moved. The wind kicked dust across their boots. Then Frank's grin dropped. "You think you can hide behind your little patch of dirt forever? How about the law on my side? A judge, a sheriff, hell, half this territory if I pay right. You'll hand that boy over, or I'll come back with a badge behind me." He turned to leave, but paused, his eyes sliding toward the house where Shella stood watching from the window. "Pretty woman," he said loud enough for Jacob to hear. "Didn't figure you for the domestic type, Stone. Be ashamed to see that face crying." Jacob's voice was low and lethal. "Ride. Now." Frank chuckled, tipped his hat, and spurred his horse. 3 days, he called over his shoulder. "Then I come with the law." The riders disappeared down the ridge, leaving silence thick as smoke. Tommy burst out crying, clutching Jacob's leg. "He's gonna take me. He's gonna take me." Jacob knelt, pulling the boy close. "No one's taking you, son. You hear me? No one." Ruth, standing in the doorway, looked at him with eyes full of fear and faith. "He's got money, Jacob. That man can twist the law into knots." Jacob's gaze hardened. "Then we untie it." That evening, after the boy was asleep, Ruth sat with Jacob on the porch. The air was heavy with the scent of rain that never came. She studied him, the way he held himself, rigid, alone, the weight of too many ghosts pressing down. "You're a good man, Jacob Stone," she said softly. "Better than you think." He gave a humorless smile. "Good men bury their wives and daughters, Mrs. Breslin. I'm just what's left." "No," Ruth said. "You're what's still standing. And you've got people who need you now. That boy looks at you like you hung the moon." And Shella, she paused, watching his reaction. "Shella's been loving you for 10 years. Jacob turned sharply. "Shella?" "No, she was Maria's friend." Ruth's tone sharpened. "She was, and she's been your friend every day since. But don't you dare pretend you don't see it. That woman stayed when everyone else left. She's cooked for you, worked beside you, kept this place running. And she never asked for a thing except maybe a smile once in a while." He looked away, jaw tightening. "Maria was my wife. I made vows. And Maria's been gone 10 years, Ruth said gently. You think she'd want you sitting here, rotting in grief? You think she'd want Shella wasting her life waiting for a man who won't look at her?" Jacob said nothing. The wind rattled the porch rail. Ruth's voice softened. "Tommy and I will move on soon. We'll find our place. But before I go, I'm going to tell you the truth. You've already got a family here. You're just too stubborn to see it." Jacob's throat worked, but no words came. Ruth rose, her old joints protesting. "Think about it, Jacob. Grief is a cage. You got the key in your pocket. Use it." She walked inside, leaving him alone with the night. In the kitchen, Ruth found Shella scrubbing dishes she'd already cleaned twice. "You need to tell him," Ruth said without preamble. Shella froze. "Tell him what? That you love him. That you've loved him since Maria died." "Lord," maybe since before. Shella shook her head, tears springing to her eyes. I can't, Mrs. Breslin. What if he turns away? What if I lose the only home I've ever had? Ruth smiled kindly. What if he doesn't? What if he's been waiting for you to remind him what living feels like? Shella looked down. I'm terrified. Good, Ruth said. That means it's real. Later that night, Jacob stood alone in the barn, brushing down copper. The sound of hooves and leather filled the silence. He was thinking of Maria, the way she'd laughed, the way she died too soon, and of Shella, who had somehow kept breathing for both of them. He didn't hear her footsteps until she spoke. Jacob, he turned, startled. She stood in the lamplight, hands clasped, eyes wide with fear and determination. I need to say something, she said. He nodded slowly. Go on. She took a deep breath. I've loved you for 10 years. The words hung between them like thunder. I love Maria. She was my sister in all but blood. But I loved you too, even when I hated myself for it. After she passed, I stayed because I couldn't bear to leave you alone. I thought maybe someday you'd see me. But you never did. Not really. Her voice broke. Now Ruth and Tommy are here, and I see you coming alive again, and I can't pretend anymore. I can't watch you find joy and stay silent. I just needed you to know. She turned to go, but Jacob reached out. Wait. She stopped, trembling. He stepped closer, his voice raw. I've been dead inside so long, I forgot what feeling anything was like. You've been here through it all, and I was too blind to see it. His eyes searched hers. I don't know if I can love again, Shella, but if I could, I think it would be you. She covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. That's enough, she whispered. That's all I needed. He reached out, brushing a tear away with his thumb, and for the first time in a decade, the air between them felt alive. Neither saw the small figures standing at the barn door. Tommy, barefoot in his nightshirt, smiling sleepily at the sight of them. Nor did they notice Ruth watching from the kitchen window, satisfaction softening her face. But out on the dark horizon, a single rider was cutting through the night toward town, a deputy carrying a summons stamped with the seal of a crooked judge. The trial was set for 3 days' time, and if Jacob Stone lost, Tommy Breslin would be taken away by force. The clock was ticking, and this newfound love had only just begun to breathe. The letter from a deputy came with a morning light and bad news. A court summons, sealed with Judge Blackwell's stamp, a man known across the territory for favoring whoever paid him best. The hearing was set for 3 days in Dust Hollow, and if they didn't appear, the law would decide in Frank Carver's favor by default. Jacob read it once, twice, then folded it slow, his jaw tight. So that's how he wants to play, he muttered. Ruth, sitting nearby with her shawl pulled tight, said quietly, Frank's got money, and he's got friends in that town. The law bends for men like him. Jacob looked at her and said, then we'll stand straighter. He rode into town that afternoon, gathering what help he could find. Dr. Hayes, the local physician, agreed to testify that Ruth was sound of mind and strong enough to care for Tommy. Father Miguel, the old priest from the mission church, promised to vouch for her character. Coleman Reed, a mine surveyor and Daniel Breslin's old friend, brought the original mining documents showing Tommy's inheritance, and proof that Frank had tried to buy the claim from Daniel weeks before his death. When Jacob returned that evening, the sun was dipping low behind the hills, and Shella met him on the porch. Did you find what you needed? She asked. Enough to start, he said, stepping past her. But before he could go inside, she caught his sleeve. Jacob, you're taking on more than one man should. He looked at her, eyes tired but steady. That boy called me Pa. That's all the reason I need. For the next 3 days, the ranch turned into a war room. Jacob and Shella went over every detail. Witness statements, documents, the likely arguments Frank's lawyer would use. Shella's handwriting filled 6 sheets, neat and precise. Ruth watched them from her chair, smiling faintly as their heads bent close together under the lamplight. They make a good team, she whispered to Tommy, who was carving a stick horse by the hearth. They make a family, the boy answered simply. The night before the trial, Tommy woke crying from a nightmare. Jacob found him sitting up, clutching his blanket. "He's gonna take me, Pa," Tommy whispered. "Frank's gonna come, and I won't get to see you again." Jacob knelt beside him, his voice steady. "Listen to me, son. I won't let anyone take you. You're mine now. You understand?" Tommy nodded, but still looked scared. Jacob placed his hand over the boy's. "I promise on my life." Morning came too soon. They rode into Dust Hollow together. Jacob, Ruth, Shella, and Tommy. The town was buzzing with gossip. Everyone knew Frank Carver had bought himself a judge. The courthouse smelled of dust, sweat, and fear. Inside, benches creaked as folks packed the room. Frank sat at the front with his lawyer, slick and smirking, like he already owned the verdict. Jacob stood beside Ruth, his broad frame casting a shadow that reached to Frank's boots. Shella sat behind him with Tommy, her hands gripping his shoulders. The bailiff called order, and the trial began. Frank's lawyer opened with a polished drawl, painting Frank as a loving stepfather wronged by a scheming old woman. "Mrs. Breslin kidnapped her grandson," he declared. "She's unfit to care for him, sickly, confused, and prone to delusions. The boy belongs with Mr. Carver, his legal guardian." He waved the forged custody papers like holy scripture. "Signed by the boy's own mother," he added. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. When Jacob's turn came, his lawyer, an honest man named Barton Wells, rose and began quietly, letting the storm settle. "This case isn't about who signed what," he said. "It's about who's telling the truth." One by one, the witnesses took the stand. Dr. Hayes spoke first. "Mrs. Breslin is as sharp as any woman I've known," he said firmly. "Her health is improving, and she's perfectly capable of raising her grandson." Father Miguel followed, his voice steady as a church bell. "I've known Ruth Breslin 20 years. She's the kind of woman who gives bread to strangers and forgiveness to enemies. If that's unfit, then we've lost the meaning of the word." Frank's lawyer scoffed, but his smirk faltered when Coleman Reed stood. The surveyor laid a set of yellowed papers on the table. "These are Daniel Breslin's original mining claim documents," he explained, "filed before the cave-in that took his life. The claim's worth $50,000, maybe more." He turned to the judge. After Daniel's death, Frank Carver tried to buy it cheap. Daniel refused. Days later, he died. Now Frank's back, trying to use the boy to get what he couldn't buy. Frank shot to his feet. "That's a damn lie." Judge Blackwell pounded his gavel. "Sit down, Mr. Carver." The outburst rattled the crowd. Jacob's lawyer stepped forward. "Seems to me, Your Honor, the only thing Mr. Carver's been interested in is money, not family." Then came the moment everyone would remember. Little Tommy took the stand. His legs barely reached the floor, and his voice shook at first. The judge leaned forward. "Son, do you understand why you're here?" Tommy nodded. "Yes, sir." "Then tell me, who do you want to live with?" The boy looked down at his hands, then at Ruth, then at Jacob. "My grandma," he said softly. "She loves me. She takes care of me. Mama left me with her." The judge asked, "And Mr. Carver?" Tommy's voice dropped. "He scares me." He paused, then added, "Mr. Jacob makes me feel safe. He's my family now." A murmur spread through the room. Even the judge seemed moved. Then, just as the air settled, the back door opened. A woman stepped in, pale, trembling, dressed in travel dust. It was Violet Carver, Tommy's mother. The crowd gasped. Frank turned red. "Sit down," he hissed. But Violet didn't. She walked straight to the front, voice shaking but clear. "Your Honor, I need to speak." The judge nodded cautiously. "Go ahead." Tears welled in her eyes. "I gave that man permission to care for Tommy because he told me it was best. I believed his lies. I thought he loved my son, but all he wanted was Daniel's mine. He used me." She looked at Frank, disgust and regret mixing in her face. "I abandoned my boy for money that wasn't even real. I can't take back what I did, but I won't let him lose Tommy too. Ruth deserves custody, not me." Not Frank. She broke down, covering her face. The courtroom was silent except for her sobs. Frank lunged toward her, shouting, "You stupid woman," but the sheriff grabbed him by the arm. "That's enough," the judge barked. He turned to the jury, though everyone already knew the outcome. "I've heard enough." His gavel came down once, sharp and final. Custody of the child, Thomas Breslin, is awarded to his grandmother, Mrs. Ruth Breslin. "Mr. Carver, you're hereby charged with fraud and conspiracy. Sheriff, take him into custody." Frank fought as they dragged him away, yelling, "This isn't over, Stone. I'll come back." But his voice was swallowed by the cheers that rose from the gallery. Outside, the sun had never looked brighter. Tommy ran into Jacob's arms, shouting, "We won, Pa." Ruth followed, smiling through tears. "We did, thanks to you." Shella came last, her eyes shining. "It's over," she whispered. Jacob looked at her, his heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the trial. "Maybe it's just beginning," he said. That night, they returned to the ranch. Hector and Dale had hung a lantern outside the house, like a beacon of welcome. Inside, Ruth made a simple supper, but it felt like a feast. They ate together, Tommy chattering, Ruth laughing softly, Jacob watching Shella across the table. When the dishes were cleared, Ruth lifted her glass. "To family," she said, "found in the strangest places." They all drank, and for a moment, the world felt right. Later, when the others had gone to bed, Ruth called Jacob aside. "You fought for us like we were your blood," she said quietly. "You are my blood now," he replied. "You and Tommy both." She smiled. "And one last thing, Jacob, don't let her wait another 10 years. He frowned. "Shella." Ruth nodded. "She's loved you long enough. You've both earned peace." Jacob stared into the dying fire, knowing she was right. He walked to the kitchen where Shella was washing dishes. She turned, startled by the look in his eyes. "Jacob," he stepped closer, his voice low and trembling. "I've been a fool," he said, "and I'm done being alone." He reached into his pocket and pulled out Maria's ring, the one he'd kept hidden for a decade. "I kept this locked away, thinking I was honoring the past. But maybe it's time I start honoring the present." Shella's breath caught. "Jacob, what are you saying?" He smiled faintly. "That I've got something to fix." She looked down at the ring, then back up, her heart racing. "You don't have to, I know," he said softly. "But I want to." And with that, the ghost that had haunted Stone's Run Ranch began to fade, leaving room for something new, something alive. The trial was over, but the real victory was just beginning. Evening shadows stretched long across Stone's Run Ranch, painting everything in soft amber light as Jacob stood in the kitchen doorway, the sound of Shella humming drifting through the room. She was cleaning up after supper, sleeves rolled up, hair loose from its braid, and he realized that for the first time in 10 years, the house didn't feel empty. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Maria's old wedding ring, turning it over in his palm. The metal had dulled with time, just like his memories, but tonight it didn't hurt the way it used to. "Shella," he said quietly. She turned, surprised. "What is it?" Jacob stepped closer, his voice gentle but sure. "This ring belonged to Maria. I've kept it locked away, thinking that was honoring her. But I was wrong." He paused, taking her hand. "Holding on to the past ain't honoring it. Living again is." Her eyes filled with tears, but before she could speak, he slipped the ring back into his pocket. "I can't give you Maria's ring," he said softly. "You deserve your own promise, not one tied to ghosts." She blinked, confused. "Jacob, He reached into his coat and drew out another ring. A simple silver band with a turquoise stone that shimmered in the lamplight. "I rode into town yesterday," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Bought this with what was left from selling one of my colts. It's not fancy, but it's yours. Only yours." Her lips trembled. "Jacob," he went down on one knee, rough hands trembling. "Shella Martinez, you've loved me when I didn't deserve it. You stayed when I gave you no reason to hope. I can't promise I'll never stumble again, but I can promise I'll love you for the rest of my life. Will you marry me?" She covered her mouth, sobbing. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes." Jacob rose, sliding the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. She threw her arms around him, and he kissed her, soft, hesitant at first, then full and certain, as though 10 years of silence had broken all at once. Behind them came a gasp, followed by a cheer. Tommy stood in the doorway, grinning ear to ear, and Ruth was beside him, leaning on her cane. "About time," Ruth said, eyes twinkling. "Took you long enough, cowboy." Jacob chuckled through tears, and Shella laughed. A sound so pure it filled every corner of the house. Tommy ran forward and hugged them both. "Does this mean Miss Shella's my ma now?" he asked, wide-eyed. Shella knelt down, brushing his cheek. "Only if you'll have me, sweetheart." The boy threw his arms around her neck. "I always wanted a ma." Jacob's throat tightened. He wrapped his arms around them both, and for the first time in years, he felt whole. The next morning, Ruth sat on the porch sipping coffee, watching the sunrise. Jacob joined her, still wearing the faintest smile. "We need to talk about arrangements," she began carefully. "Arrangements?" he repeated. "Tommy and I. Well, we should find our own place soon. You and Shella need your life." Jacob shook his head before she could finish. "You're not going anywhere." Ruth tried to protest, but he cut her off. "You saved that boy. You brought life back into this house. You belong here, Ruth. This is your home now." She looked away, eyes misting. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're a blessing," he said firmly. "Your family." Shella appeared in the doorway, smiling. "Please stay. I need a mother around. Tommy needs his grandmother. Jacob needs someone to keep him in line." Ruth laughed, shaking her head. "You two don't know what you're a skin for, but all right. I'll stay, long as you don't expect me to milk cows." "Deal," Jacob said, grinning. They decided Ruth would have her own small cottage built behind the main house, where she could have peace and quiet but still be close enough for supper and stories. Within a month, the ranch looked livelier than ever. Flowers planted by Shella, Tommy helping Dale in the stables, and Ruth rocking on her porch every evening with her knitting. When spring came, the valley exploded with color. Wildflowers covered the hills, and the whole town of Dust Hollow seemed to forget the cold days that had come before. Word spread quickly. Jacob Stone was marrying Shella Martinez, and half the county wanted to see it. The wedding was held in a meadow behind the ranch, under the open sky. Father Miguel stood before a wooden arch draped in white cloth, his Bible gleaming in the sunlight. Guests filled the benches. Hector, Dale, the townsfolk who once whispered about Jacob's grief, now smiling and clapping. Shella wore a cream-colored dress with wildflowers woven into her hair. Jacob had borrowed a pressed black suit from Hector, looking more nervous than he had during any gunfight. Tommy, proud as ever, stood as the ring bearer in a tiny vest that matched Jacob's. Ruth sat in the front row, her eyes shining like the sun itself. When the music stopped, Father Miguel began. "We gather here today not to forget the past, but to bless what has grown from it," he said. Jacob took Shella's hands. "Shella, you taught me that love doesn't die. It just waits for the right moment to bloom again. I promise to love you, honor you, and never make you wait in silence again." Her voice trembled when she answered. "Jacob, I've loved you through seasons of grief, and now I'll love you through seasons of joy. I promise to stand beside you, build with you, and cherish this family we've been given." Tommy stepped forward with the rings, his hands shaking but smiling from ear to ear. "Here, Pa," he whispered. Jacob took the ring and slid it onto Shella's finger. She did the same for him, and when Father Miguel said, "You may kiss the bride," Jacob didn't hesitate. The crowd cheered, Ruth laughed, and Tommy jumped into the air shouting, "We did it!" They celebrated late into the night. The tables overflowed with food: roast beef, fresh bread, Ruth's famous peach cobbler. There was music and dancing, laughter and storytelling. Tommy danced with Ruth, his tiny boots kicking up dust, while Jacob and Shella shared their first dance under the stars. "You're smiling," Shella whispered. "That's new." Jacob grinned. "Get used to it." When the guests finally left, the ranch grew quiet again. The four of them sat on the porch, watching the last embers of sunset fade behind the hills. "Feels like home," Ruth said softly. "That's because it is," Jacob replied. Months passed, and the peace held. The new cottage stood proudly behind the main house, its windows glowing warm at night. Ruth filled it with herbs and laughter, her door always open for Tommy, who visited every evening for a story. Jacob and Shella ran the ranch together, side by side, building something that felt solid and real. Tommy grew stronger, smarter, happier, his laughter the soundtrack of every morning. He called Shella now without hesitation, and every time he did, her heart swelled. The neighbors said Stone's Run Ranch had never looked better. Fences mended, fields fertile, and light shining from its windows long after dusk. One evening, as the sun melted into gold across the horizon, Jacob sat with Shella, Ruth, and Tommy on the porch. The air was soft and full of peace. Tommy sat between them, swinging his legs. "Is this forever, Pa?" he asked. Jacob smiled, wrapping an arm around Shella's shoulders. "This is forever, son." Ruth rocked gently in her chair, her voice soft and certain. "Sometimes the desert takes everything," she said, looking out toward the horizon. "And sometimes it gives you exactly what you need." Shella leaned her head on Jacob's shoulder. "A family," she whispered. The old woman smiled. "Exactly that." The sun dipped below the ridge, painting them all in the warm light of a new beginning. In the quiet that followed, there was no sound but the creak of Ruth's chair, the chirp of crickets, and the steady heartbeat of a home reborn. And in that golden silence, the story of four broken souls, Jacob, Shella, Ruth, and Tommy, came together at last, bound not by blood, but by love strong enough to outlast the desert itself.